Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. For the video today, I decided I was going to go back to not only my favorite decade for horror movies, but also to my favorite horror subgenre for this particular installment. So, in short, I'm going to be reviewing two haunted house movies from the 1970s, both of which have made numerous appearances on various underrated lists around the internet, which is where I ended up hearing about them, and both of which happened to have been made for television. Again, that was a complete coincidence when I decided to do this double feature. So the first one we're going to be talking about is from 1972, and it's called Something Evil. Now, this was a TV movie that was directed by none other than Steven Spielberg himself, and aired not too long after his, I feel like, much better known classic made for TV film Duel, which was, based on the Richard Matheson story. But Something Evil actually features a lot of really familiar 1970s actors. Darren McGavin is in it, who, horror fans will probably know from like Kolchak, among many other things. Sandy Dennis is in this, who is in God Told Me To. And you also have the kid actor, Johnny Whitaker, the red-haired kid from Family Affair. So he's in this as well. Now, the story is a pretty standard haunted house / possession story. It's kind of concerns a city slicker ad executive, his sort of hippie-esque artist wife, and their two kids moving from New York City out to this sort of like charming rural house in Pennsylvania Dutch country, which, spoiler alert, turns out to be infested with demons. I hate when that happens. So while Something Evil, due to its subject matter, bears a kind of superficial resemblance to other sort of like devil possession movies that came out, a few years prior, around the same time period, such as Rosemary's Baby and stuff like that. Although this predated The Exorcist, not the novel, I don't think, but it predated the movie. I actually found myself comparing this movie less to stuff like that, like more kind of satanic possession stuff, and more to like rural or folk horror stories of the same era, kind of like The Other, The Wicker Man, Burnt Offerings, which actually came later, although like I said, that was from a novel, or Harvest Home, because it kind of had like a folk horror kind of like flavor to it as well. So you get, at the very beginning, you have like sort of like a cold open, which is kind of like features this old man who is presumably the house's former owner, being kind of chased through a hex symbol adorned barn by some invisible force, and then he falls to his death from the hayloft. So after that happens, a family called the Worden family, they buy the property after the wife, Marjorie, the aforementioned hippie artist type, she actually fell in love with the place while they were on vacation out there. So they end up buying the house. Not too long afterward, though, just like always in these movies, things start to go south. Although it's actually not clear at first whether something's wrong with the actual house or with Marjorie, who seems a little bit flaky and a little bit unstable. I gotta say, even though this movie is pretty short, it's only about 73 minutes, it still does a pretty good job. Like, it's a very, very effective, like, slow burn type of story, which is actually pretty impressive considering that it's not really all that long. And it does actually do a lot with a pretty simple premise. So at first, you only get minor hints that something is wrong. For example, like, locals keep telling the family that something's odd about the house. The townsfolk all seem to genuinely believe that devils are legit real, which is a little bit weird. Also, one of their neighbors also seems to make a point of like ritualistically killing chickens in the yard and then flinging the blood around, which, they're a little alarmed by, as you would be. Also, as if that wasn't unsettling enough, Marjorie thinks she hears, like repeatedly, she thinks she hears a baby crying out in the barn. But then when she goes to look, there's nothing there. She starts getting more and more interested in the occult, and with all of this kind of like hex symbology that's very prevalent in the area. Early on in the movie, a couple attending their housewarming party, like at this new house, is killed in a mysterious car accident on the way home. I believe it's like a one-car accident. And so that kind of like feeds into Marjorie's paranoia that something evil has been unleashed in the house, like, due to her actions. Now, naturally, again, as is the case with a lot of these movies from this era and even ones from nowadays, Marjorie's husband, Paul, thinks she's losing her mind because he's pretty much away at work all the time. I think he still works in New York City, so he's, like, commuting back and forth. So he didn't really see, like, any of the phenomena that Marjorie claims is taking place in this house. And as I said, for a while, it does seem like Marjorie herself is maybe the problem because she's getting depressed, suicidal. She even starts getting, like, violent towards her own kids. It gets to the point where she paints a hex symbol on the floor as protection and keeps her children, like, locked away, like, to protect them from her because she knows she's, like, losing it. She doesn't, like, trust herself around them. She really begins to think that she's been possessed by demons, like the demons that are in this house. In the final twist, though, and this is a spoiler alert if you have not seen this movie, it actually comes to light that Marjorie is not, I mean, the demons are real for sure, but Marjorie is actually not the receptacle for the demons. It actually turns out to be the character played by Johnny Whitaker, the kid, Stevie, whose demon hosting status is actually revealed at the end in a twist that I actually, to be fair, did not see coming. It is pretty, like, a well-staged, like an exorcism type of scene where he's, like, floating and doing scary voices and stuff like that. So it was, like, kind of, it's interesting because that kind of bit went a little bit over the top, but that was okay because the rest of it was, like, pretty low-key, and I thought it worked out pretty good. And like I said, I thought something was the matter with the mom, so it really kind of, like, threw me for a loop, and they're like, nope, surprise, it's the kid, and he starts floating and, like, talking to crazy demon boys and shit like that. I'm like, oh, fuck me, wow. So, while the plot of Something Evil will be extremely familiar to anyone with even a passing knowledge of horror films from this era, or from any era, to be honest with you, I have to say Steven Spielberg's direction really does elevate what could have been maybe just sort of like a forgettable throwaway 70s TV movie into something that's actually, like, pretty intriguing and pretty creepy. It really seems to use its presumably what was a very tight budget, like, to really, really good effect. So everything is kept very understated, but everything's a little bit off kilter as well. And so everything seems, like, laden with dread, but still, you know, pretty believable and grounded, like, at least up until the end when the, you know, more overt possession stuff happens. I mean, the movie has these really, like, eerie, surreal kind of touches. Like, remember when I said earlier that that Marjorie kept thinking she heard a baby crying, like, out in the barn, and, like, she goes out there and it seems like the baby crying is sort of, like, emanating from this weird, like, mason jar, like, full of red goo, which I thought was, like, which really creeped me the fuck out for some reason. It's like, why are my preserves crying like a baby? But it didn't look like preserves. It almost kind of looked like, I don't know. Did it just look like a human smoothie? I don't know what it looked like, but it was just like, I don't know. It was, like, really freaky. It freaked me out a little bit. There was also, like, a scene where unexpectedly this pair of, like, glowing red eyes, like, turns up in a photograph at Paul's advertising agency in New York City. So obviously, like, the shit's sort of, like, following them around. So, I mean, there's no rotating heads or pea soup vomit or anything like that, but I feel like the low-key effects really do work within the whole kind of gestalt of the movie. So Something Evil, I would definitely recommend it, not only to fans of Steven Spielberg who are maybe curious about his real early work and haven't seen this one. I know a lot of Spielberg fans have probably seen Duel because that was a lot better known than this one, but this one came out, I think, a little bit before, a little bit after, I can't remember, and I feel like nobody really talks all that much about it, but I actually, like, enjoyed it quite a lot. And, you know, I just really like 70s haunted house movies. I really kind of like, there was a lot of really good made-for-TV horror, like, back in this era, and this is definitely one of them, and I kind of feel like it kind of needs more, it needs more love, I feel like, because it doesn't really get talked about all that much. So next up on our double feature is another sort of haunted house movie, which was made for TV, but this time it was made actually for British TV. And this was from 1973, and it's called The Stone Tape. Now, this was actually written by Nigel Kneale, who is actually very, very well known in the UK. Probably most famous for writing the Quatermass series of movies, but he's written a lot of other stuff as well. This movie was actually broadcast on BBC Two, I believe, as a Christmas ghost story. But it's kind of a ghost story. I mean, it is a ghost story, but it's actually kind of more of a mashup between, like, an old school Victorian style classic ghost story and sort of like tech driven sci-fi. similar in concept to what you saw in like The Legend of Hell House, you know what I mean, where it's like this old creepy gothic haunted house thing, but then there's like technology where they're using technology to like solve the problem, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like that kind of vibe to it. So the story revolves around this gaggle of kind of laddish, wisecracking scientists who are in the process of moving into their new research facility. And this research facility is in a partially renovated and reputedly haunted mansion / castle type situation called Taskerlands. So the scientists are apparently trying to develop a new recording medium because at this time, like, you know, the Japanese were like way ahead with technology. So they're trying to get the cutting edge away from their Japanese competitors by coming up with something new. And that's what they're working on. But the only female member of the team, a computer programmer named Jill, who is also evidently somewhat psychic, almost immediately sees a ghost in the unrenovated portion of the mansion. And shortly after that, the male members of the team all hear this blood-curdling scream, or screams rather, coming from the same area. Now, it comes to light that the ghost, if that is indeed what it is very likely that of a maid named Louisa, who died by falling down the stairs many years before, and that the part of the house that's home to the ghost is also really, really old, like maybe dating back to like the Saxon era. So we're talking like super, super old. But yeah, so they do a lot of research and find out about that. Now, interestingly, everybody, I mean, this was the early 1970s, and I feel like parapsychology was still like kind of a respected, field. So even though these are all scientists, you know, as soon as they all hear the screams and she sees the ghost and everything like that, they're all pretty much on board with, yeah, it's a ghost. And they try to like figure out what's going on with it. Now, they're all like kind of freaked out and disturbed by it, as you would be, but they're also really curious. And they're kind of keen to use all this state of the art like research equipment that they brought with them to record and study the phenomena. So they're kind of like really jazzed about it. So after a bunch of like theorizing and other sort of like, you know, paranormal jiggery pokery type stuff, they figure out that the stone walls of the old room are kind of acting as some sort of crude recording device, essentially, that takes impressions of extreme emotions that occurred in the room. But that instead of just recording like one of these newfangled magnetic tapes that all the kids are talking about these days, the mechanism is actually dependent upon the sensitivities and emotional states of the living people present. In other words, that the humans witnessing the haunting are sort of like analogous to amplifiers for the titular stone tape, if that makes any sense. So the scientists are actually like kind of intrigued by this whole hypothesis, hoping that this might be the scientific breakthrough that they're looking for that's going to put them ahead of their technological rivals in Japan. However, the more they try to get the phenomena to kind of perform for their tests, the more frustrated they get, till at last it seems that they've accidentally, erased the recording of Louisa's death. And after that happens, I can't remember exactly what the parameters of it were, but yeah, they end up like erasing the haunting essentially. So they're kind of like, well, obviously we fucked it all up. Shit happens. So they decide they're going to abandon the project since they believe that the haunting is now gone and there's nothing left to study. Jill, though, she's not having it. She's actually, again, she's kind of like portrayed as having more psychic sensitivities than the male, members of the team. So she thinks that there might be something deeper lurking at Taskerlands. She hypothesizes that Louisa's ghost might have been only like the top layer of the recording, and that older recordings might have been overlaid by the most recent one. So like, whatever the haunting was that was recorded by the stone tape, like the walls or whatever, if a new haunting came along or some other horrible thing happened there, it would kind of like essentially overwrite the other one, but it still might be accessible if you knew what you were doing. Now, bolstering her theory, because she kind of like looks into, if this might be the case. So she goes and sees this local priest. And the priest tells her that there was an unsuccessful exorcism performed on the land back in 1760 before the house was there, like before the main part of the house was even there, suggesting to her that the land itself has been haunted for far longer than anybody realized. She also has like a really frightening episode like in the house when she hears and feels like a malevolent presence, but nobody else seems to hear it or sense it or anything like that. So Jill tries to tell the remainder of the team about her discovery and about all the research and history that she's been looking into, but no one really wants to listen at this point. It seemed like they were super jazzed like when Louisa's ghost was kind of like doing all the shit and they had, but once they sort of erased it and they couldn't really hear it or see it anymore, then they sort of like very quickly lost interest. And it turns out that the director of the project, who is also a friend of Jill's, his name's Peter, and he basically tells her, hey, why don't you take a 2-month leave, because I think like you're losing your shit, you damn woman. It's kind of like, which is, you know, not spoken outright, but implied. Before she leaves though, she goes into the room like one last time where most of the haunting was taking place, and again, spoiler alert, gets killed by the entity. The men actually come across and find her later, and her eyes are like frozen open in terror. As if this wasn't shitty enough, like that she goes in there like one last time to like experience, and then she gets killed. Peter, the director, who was supposedly her friend, right, and her colleague, in a final little fuck you, Peter goes to the authorities and tells them that Jill was emotionally unstable, and he also destroys all the research that she did that showed that the evil presence might have been there for like, I think it was like 7,000 years or something like that. What a shitbag. It's like, I was watching this movie and I'm like, oh my god, dude, I can't fucking believe you did that. What an asshole. But I will say that even though Jill is dead, which is sad, but she does get some small measure of revenge from beyond the grave when Peter actually goes into the haunted room at the end and is subjected to the most recent recording, which was Jill's voice screaming his name before her death and begging him to help her. I loved that fucking ending. It was so, so good. I have to admit, though, overall, I didn't like this one quite as much as Something Evil, but it was still like a pretty entertaining, because I'm not a huge sci-fi person, you know what I mean? Like, I like some sci-fi and some sci-fi horror crossovers, but it's usually not my go-to. I usually like kind of more old school, like ghost stories, just straight up ghost stories. But this was still like a pretty entertaining, you know, mashup between sort of like a sci-fi based ghost story. And I have to say that it was a little bit heavier on the sci-fi than on the ghosts, you know what I mean? The acting was a little bit stagey, and at the beginning of the movie, like before the haunting stuff happened, when it was all these kind of laddish scientists, as I mentioned, it almost came off like a vaudevillian like routine, because they were all like making cracks and like funny shit and everything, and I was just kind of like, really, this is supposed to be a horror movie? Okay. It was like that. But I mean, I kind of feel like that went along, that there was kind of like a lot of stuff on British television like that, like back in those days. So, you know, I'm not going to get too mad about it. Honestly, once it moved past that, it was pretty effective, you know, and pretty scary. Though I have to say, like, also like a lot of films of the time, it takes a while to get where it's going. It's kind of like talky, and the full impact of the story doesn't really come to fruition until the final couple of minutes. Like I said, when Peter goes into the room and like hears the latest recording, which is his friend and colleague Jill like screaming for help. If you liked The Legend of Hell House, but you thought that it needed more focus on the haunting machine rather than the ghosty shit, then you'll probably love this, because that's essentially exactly what this is. It's a pretty similar concept to that. A matter of fact, the hypothesis that ghosts are simply recordings of past events that have somehow kind of been captured by surrounding materials, usually like stone or clay or something like that, is still known, as far as I know, is still known in paranormal circles as the stone tape theory. And this is where they got that name from, like that some materials can actually record heightened emotions or, you know, things like that, just, you know, from the surrounding air or whatever. I'd also recommend this to anybody that liked the Quatermass movies or other kind of 70s British sci-fi horror crossovers like The Asphyx or The Projected Man, which was not a great movie, but it made a hilarious Mystery Science Theater episode, so you should definitely check that out. It's not a bad movie. It's actually like a pretty good idea, but the execution was a little bit thing. But it's very, very similar to that. Like, it's got like scary stuff in it and it's ghosts and stuff, but it's mostly scientific based. It's a very parapsychological, you know, parapsychology type of story. So there's that. So that will do it. Thank you for watching this installment on Scare Salon, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.